Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. It's a great pleasure to be joined today by Noa Lazimi from the Misgav Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy. Noa, so good to have you. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Noa, so many of our viewers have been sending in questions, and we always like to be relevant and answer the questions people want to know. And they want to know about Qatar, they want to know about Turkey, and how those two nations are really intimately connected with the future of Gaza. So, you know a lot about this. Let's just jump in. So, not long ago, Qatar was attacked by Israel, as we all know, and Turkey was not very involved in the hostage negotiations. What were the main factors that brought them center stage?
Right. So Trump realized how important Qatar and Turkey are, given their power and influence over Hamas as its main backers. So he used this as leverage to isolate Hamas and pressure Hamas into accepting a deal. What facilitated this process of reaching the agreement was also the Israeli attack in Doha, because while it was not very effective in terms of killing the Hamas senior leaders, it demonstrated that Qatar was no longer immune and that it was a legitimate target for Israel. So, combining these factors, we ended up with a quite remarkable achievement for Israel within the framework of Trump's plan, at least in its initial stage. And I want to emphasize that because there is a long road and complex road ahead of us. But we were able to free all the live hostages in one phase while still maintaining military presence in Gaza. And so it's true that we're still waiting for the remaining dead hostages, and they were also part of the deal, obviously. But still, on the whole, it's a significant progress. However, it came with a cost, and in exchange for the Turkish and Qatari cooperation, they probably received some substantial benefits. So, if we look at Qatar, it started off with Netanyahu's reserved, maybe hesitant apology, but still a public apology. And obviously, the defense agreement with the United States, other security benefits that followed. And more than anything else, Qatar was able to repair its international image and to be seen as this constructive player, positive mediator, when in truth, it's a major sponsor of terrorism. Now, if we look at Turkey, then before Trump's plan, then the Turks were pretty much banned from the negotiation table when it came to hostages and the Gaza situation. And they were attempts by Turkey to get involved, but this was generally blocked by Israel. And now we've seen that Turkey has received this honor, seat of honor around the table. For example, in the New York summit, we saw Erdogan sitting next to President Trump, and both were facing all the other Arab nations. And I can also assume that again, as part of the Turkish involvement and the cooperation and the pressure on Hamas, it probably paved the way for potential future purchase of the F-35 fighter jets later down the road. And so it's not that Israel thought that there was not going to be a price to pay. And I think we're all aware of that. But I think what worries Israel the most now is that by bringing both Qatar and Turkey on board with Trump's plan, Trump essentially opened the gate for deeper, long term involvement in Gaza, which could compromise Israeli security interests.
So, no doubt that the Qataris have strategic and financial interests in their dealings with the U.S. But so, what are their interests in Gaza? How does that long term look for Qatar?
So let's start with the ideological aspect. So ideologically, Qatar has always been a major supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, with Hamas being its Palestinian offshoot in Gaza Strip. Now, back in 2007, Sheikh Hamad, the father of the current Emir of Qatar, Tamim, pledged his support for the Gaza Strip. It was right after Hamas took over Gaza, and I want to remind our audience by throwing Fatah people off the roofs of Gaza. And ever since, we are all aware of the generous, enormous Qatari contribution, the money transfer to Hamas, to Gaza, over the past 2 decades. Now, we also have to take into account that Qatar used to host the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, Sheikh Yusuf Al Qaradawi. He was forced to flee Egypt in the 1960s and received a very warm welcome in Qatar, including a popular TV show in the Qatari owned media network, Al Jazeera. And Al Jazeera, its role in the incitement to terror and the spread of radical Islamist ideology cannot be overstated. Before the war and during the war, they constantly propagated Hamas narrative messages, and some of their so called journalists and reporters have been found to have direct links with the terror organization. So this just goes to show how close Hamas and Qatar are. But more like strategically speaking, so for Qatar, supporting Hamas is a means of influence in the Palestinian arena, in Palestinian affairs. Now, in general, Qatar has this, like, it's a main pillar in its foreign policy, even though it's not a declared official strategy, is to fund and maintain close ties with numerous terror organizations like the Taliban, the Houthis, Hamas, obviously, and others, with whom most Western nations don't usually hold direct talks. So this allows Qatar to position itself as this useful mediator because it operates on all fronts. It basically speaks with everyone. So gradually, Qatar has been perceived as this pragmatic Muslim country that can contribute to mitigating crises around the globe and resolving conflicts. Now, back to Gaza, and we can conclude the answer with that. We see the same conduct, the same motives here. So, by getting involved in Gaza and its reconstruction process, and then especially under U.S. auspices, that Qatar can rebuild its reputation again as this positive mediator. It also allows it to gain a greater status compared to its Gulf rivals, for example, the UAE and Saudi Arabia in the regional arena. And lastly, like you mentioned, enhancing the U.S. Qatar ties is good for Qatar. It gives it a wide range of security benefits. And for a small state of like Qatar, which doesn't have a large army and doesn't have these impressive military capabilities, securing this international standing and the close ties with the United States is a significant asset.
Okay, so Qatar benefits from Gaza. What about Turkey? How does it view Gaza and Hamas in light of its own strategic interests?
Well, when it comes to Turkey, I worry that this situation is even more volatile because unlike the Qataris that mainly utilize soft power tools to secure their international status, the Turks have greater ambitions for the entire region, for the Middle East. So Erdogan sees Turkey as the leader of the Sunni Muslim world. And as part of his vision, is also expanding into Syria, as we all know, we all see this, in an attempt to turn it into a client state. Now, if we link it to Israel, then now he's trying to create this pressure on Israel in sort of this pincer maneuver, we can call it this way, because we have the Syrian front in the north, and now by trying to establish permanent presence in Gaza, so we also have a Turkish involvement in the like a base, not yet, but this is their attempt in Gaza in the south. And it's, by the way, along the same lines, it poses a double threat to Egypt from both the west and the east, because I want to remind our audience that Erdogan employs proxies in Libya, so to the west of Egypt. So again, it's kind of like this clutching in on its regional rivals or enemies. Now, we also have to take into account that there is a lot of economic interest involved. So the prospect of reconstructing Gaza opens the door for a lot of opportunities for Turkish contractors, especially. And there may also be plans for building a port on the Mediterranean. And lastly, I want to add the ideological aspect. Let us be clear. Turkey is an avid supporter of Hamas, no less than Qatar, maybe even more. and they justify hosting Hamas leadership, the people who planned the October 7 attack and are responsible for building the Hamas financial empire on Turkish soil using Turkish banks. So they justified by the fact that these people belong to what they call the political wing and not the military wing of Hamas. Erdogan also constantly tries to portray himself as the flag bearer of the so-called Palestinian cause, which he keeps using for political purposes and obviously also to bash Israel.
Okay, so then how in practice are Turkey and Qatar threatening Israel's interests? Maybe there are some examples to really give us an insight about the conflict in goals and in Gaza.
Right. So since Hamas, the involvement with Hamas and Gaza gives both Qatar and Turkey access to more power and influence in the Palestinian arena and beyond, we must operate under the assumption that these two will look out for Hamas' best interests because, again, there is this mutual benefit here. So, for example, under the guise of humanitarian missions, Turkey and Qatar are trying to buy Hamas time to regroup, reorganize, rebuild, and at the same time normalize their presence in Gaza. So, just recently, the Turks have sent, I think it was 80 engineers and heavy machinery into the Gaza Strip to supposedly help retrieve the dead hostages, the bodies of the Israeli hostages. Now, even if that were true, we have to understand that the main motive behind such an initiative is to lay the groundwork for permanent deployment of Turkish personnel or forces. And we also have to remember that Hamas deliberately delays the return of the dead hostages. Israel knows for a fact that, at least for some of the hostages, maybe not all of them, but for some of them, Hamas knows the locations of the bodies. So when Qatar and Turkey embark on this so-called rescue mission, they are in fact reinforcing these manipulative tactics used by Hamas and legitimizing his blatant violations of the ceasefire. So this is something we have to take into account because it's not as explicit as we might expect. Now, even if you move forward to the next stage of the agreement, assuming that we will achieve that next stage, then Turkey and Qatar will try to keep Hamas in power. So, in the event of the formation of this ISF, the International Stabilizing Force, and the technocratic government that's supposed to be set up, so they will want again to keep Hamas alive. They would want to send troops to this multinational force. I think this applies more to Turkey than to Qatar, and also push for Hamas affiliated representatives in the future government of Gaza. So essentially, what they're trying to do, they're seeking to devise this, let's say, mechanism, formulas that will effectively prevent the dismantling of Hamas and its removal from power, contrary to Israeli and American interests and the whole purpose of this plan.
So, anyone who's watched these briefings even a few times knows that we often stress that the way that the West views the Middle East is very different than the way the countries here themselves have an outlook on what's happening. So, how would you say the Trump administration sees Qatar and Turkey's role in the region?
So Trump is not naive. He's well aware of the problematic aspects of the Qatari and Turkish foreign policy, and he's obviously aware of the ties to Hamas, etc. And most importantly, I think Trump understands perfectly that the main obstacle to on the road to implementing his vision of stability and prosperity for the Middle East is Hamas. And he wants to create this new architecture where that can be preserved and sustained by the cooperation of the moderate, the pragmatic Arab nations of the region and Israel. And so I think that from his perspective, Turkey and Qatar can play this constructive role. They can contribute their share in the reconstruction of Gaza, for example, and maybe even in the future management of the Strip. Now, also want to add that the ultimate goal is to reclaim U.S. position as a reliable, dependable ally to the Middle Eastern nations, thereby drawing them farther away from Chinese and Russian influence, and at the same time weaken Iran. So again, I think that Trump can envision this regional cooperation in which Qatar and Turkey are essential or integral parts of. Now, the problem is obviously Israel sees things very differently and thinks of the damage that can be inflicted by bringing those two countries center stage. So I think the Israeli fear is exactly that this, let's say, transactional diplomacy downplays the risks entailed in bringing these two countries to the front. And and Israel, is, let's say that this fear is amplified by the fact that we know that the U.S. and Qatar has strong ties and increasing collaboration, strategic and economic collaboration. On top of that, Trump respects Erdogan very much. And I think he's also, at least it seems like he's willing to move beyond past strengths, such as the Turkish purchase of the Russian, the S-400 air defense system. So, bottom line is that we fear in Israel that there is a lot of emphasis on the bigger picture, this really inspirational and admirable vision for the Middle East of prosperity and stability and wealth and the like, but less attention is given to the finer details, the complex clauses of the agreement that make up the agreement that dictate the execution of the plan. And we worry that hostile actors like Turkey and Qatar may try to exploit the situation to endanger Israeli interests.
Noah, given all of this, what should Israel be doing right now to secure its interests and at the same time really maintain good coordination with the US?
So, first, I would like to address the ceasefire situation. Obviously, we are witnessing Hamas repeated violations of the ceasefire time and time again. Not only the deliberate delay of the bodies of the Israeli hostages, but also a number of attacks against the IDF. In one of these attacks, two soldiers got killed. It was a very recent attack. And Israel, we have to admit, we responded quite leniently. And we're in a quite tough position because we do want to get back as all the hostages, obviously, and at the same time secure American support and maintain this good cooperation we have with the United States. But we still have to make sure that we don't make this restraint strategy a blank check, because we cannot afford going back to this old paradigm of measured, predictable responses to Hamas aggression. And that's essentially what brought us to the October 7 in 2023. And eventually, Hamas wants to use it to its advantage. And this only encourages more and more attacks against Israel. So there has to be some red lines set here in the talks with US officials. And I think it's important. Now, if you go back to Qatar and Turkey, then and also we have to remember that Hamas again uses this restraint in order to buy time to regroup and attempting to kidnap, to abduct soldiers, because it knows that this is its most valuable card, the hostages, and that can give it advantage, which will prove catastrophic, obviously, for Israel. So we have to bear that in mind. And now going back to Qatar and Turkey. So Israel has to work with the United States in order to minimize as much as possible the role of these two countries in Gaza. So we're talking about the ISF, obviously the International Stabilizing Force, and also the technocratic government that's supposed to be formed. So Israel cannot afford having Turkish soldiers or Qatari soldiers patrolling Gaza. And again, I think it applies more to Turkey, but still, as a matter of principle. And nor can it let Doha and Ankara to have a say in the future government of Gaza. Again, they will try to push to keep Hamas in power and to pave the way for its absolute takeover of the Gaza Strip, basically reestablish its rules. So we have to maintain our veto power in order to at least, I don't know if we can decide, but at least approve the composition of both the ISF and the technocratic government.
So, Turkish President Erdogan is talking about attacking Israel. Is that a likely threat, in your opinion?
Um, Despite Erdogan very harsh rhetoric and hostility, growing hostility, especially ever since the sort of Iran broke, I don't think this is a likely scenario at this point, because Erdogan himself understands that he has to be wise about how he wants to go about weakening Israel. He doesn't want to be perceived still a NATO Turkey is a NATO member, and with interests with the United States. He doesn't want to be perceived as going after Israel so forcefully, and he knows obviously that this will anger Washington, seeing that Israel is probably its closest ally. And so I think he wouldn't pursue this path, even though, by the way, he has capabilities. Just for as an example, we know that Erdogan, Turkey has invested a lot of resources in developing missiles and drones that can reach Israel. Now, we can say that at the very least that they are under development. And of course, there are other means, but we don't have to go into these details because I don't think this is his intention at the moment. And I want to be careful saying that. But there is, I think, what's more probable is an indirect attack by using Syrian proxies. Erdogan has funded, armed, trained numerous rebel groups in Syria over the last decade and more, and these people are obviously not very friendly to Israel. And so he theoretically he can arm these groups to facilitate attacks against Israel on the Israel-Syria border and put the communities of the Golan and the Galilee at risk. I'm not insinuating that this is what he's doing at the moment, but it is a possible risk that we have to take into account. I think there are two main restraining factors here. One, again, is the relationship with the United States. So, owing to that, I think he will be cautious. And second is the fact that Israel was able to draw red lines in Syria quite successfully and establish some level of deterrence. So again, I think these two factors, and maybe some others, um, will probably push Erdogan away from pursuing this path. But still, I want to say that we should take his threats very seriously. I don't take them lightly. We have to monitor the developments on the ground and respond accordingly.
No, I really appreciate you taking all of my questions. Last question for the day. When the Qatari Prime Minister recently met the Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs, they reportedly spoke, among other things, about activity in Judea and Samaria. What do you think their interests are beyond the border of Gaza, really in broader Israel?
So the Turkish and Qatari involvement extends beyond Gaza to include all Palestinian territories, including Judea and Samaria. And as expected, they, for example, have condemned Israeli plans for applying Israeli law in Judea and Samaria, or any other initiative or move that could enhance Israeli sovereignty over these territories and in general. So this is quite predictable, a move by these two countries. Now we also have to remember that alongside the close ties with Hamas, they are engaged in talks with the PA, with the Palestinian Authority, including holding meetings and discussions primarily on the Gaza situation because it's a top priority at the moment, but also more broadly on the idea of Palestinian statehood, with them championing for a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. And I would want to emphasize another point here that Turkey has been very active in terms of subversion attempts within Israel. So, for example, it concentrates a lot of efforts to instigate the Muslim population in East Jerusalem, in the Old City, the Temple Mount area, by funding Islamic organizations such as TIKA is one of the most prominent out of these Turkish organizations, and that they promote this radical Muslim agenda. So this is one form of this subversion of Turkey.
Noa Lazimi from the Misgav Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy. Thank you so much for joining me. Always a pleasure to speak with you and learn from you. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing. We will be back with you. And again, note the time change tomorrow, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. here in Israel. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.